Right, so this time I've read We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families. Stories from Rwanda. Um, and right off the bat, I want to say this is an incredible book. I really enjoyed it. I'd been sort of aware of this book, like it had been kind of in my peripheral vision for a little while. I have an interest in African history, and especially, and also an interest in, just the most horrible things that have ever happened to people. And Rwanda is an overlap between those two interests. So this book had been sort of in my peripheral vision for a while, and I didn't bother picking it up because of the kind of like clickbaity title. But recently, I've uh, gotten into a situation where I basically just need to learn a lot more about Rwanda, and I was hoping this book would give me a bunch of like little stories from the genocide that I could pick out. And it's not that at all. Despite the name of the book, it's not stories from Rwanda. What it is a comprehensive but not exhaustive detail, a history of the Rwandan genocide, with narratives interwoven within it. It's a really promising way to tell a history, I think, because the author has a couple of normal people that he's interviewed. Like he has like news stories and people that he keeps coming back to say like, to give like accounts from their lives, that he has side by side with the event. So he'll talk about the colonial period, for instance, and then he'll talk about like one of the people whose stories he's interweaving with historical events. He'll talk about how they lived through the colonial period. Then he'll talk about the emergence of the genocide, the emergence of like increasing tensions, um, and then he'll talk about how that affected that person's life. And it's really just an absolutely fucking brilliant way to organize a history book. Like it's very readable, while also being very informative. And the thing that really blew me away about this book is I feel like there's sort of a trade-off sometimes between readability and how like informative something is, especially when we're talking about history and historical narrative. But this technique that he uses uh, really makes it so that there's no trade-off whatsoever. It gives you, the historical detail and the oomph and the sort of nuance that you need for to understand like what happened in history, while also giving you the like, sort of in color version through these personal narratives. Really, just like absolutely brilliant stuff. I wish there was a book like this for everything. Maybe there is, maybe the books that have like clickbaity titles, maybe they're all like this, and I'm only just finding out now because this is the first time I've read a book with such a catchy, title. Um, okay, yeah. So this time I've put my review. That's my summary. That's my conclusion, which I've decided to put at the beginning. But I also want to kind of summarize what's actually in the book, the explanation of the Rwandan genocide. Um, and to start with, I wanna address sort of a racist thing that people say in general about African history, and in particular about the Rwandan genocide, where they will say essentially that, um, or they will imply, or sometimes just directly say, that these conflicts are not comprehensible to outsiders because they have this such a like thick ancient history. Um, and what's interesting to me here, I've noticed sometimes my students will do this, where they will say that they'll talk about African history as being really complicated, but when they say that, it's not complexity as in like, oh, this is a complex thing, like let's try to understand it. The complexity is being gestured to as an excuse to sort of stop paying attention. And I think in the case of the Rwandan genocide, pointing to this as some sort of like ancient tribal hatred is a way to basically just hand wave it away. To say, oh, well, you don't have to understand this stuff because it's so sort of like, people are just like that since time immemorial. People give a very similar approach. People do something really similar with the Israel-Palestine conflict, where they talk about this conflict as if it's something that's been unfolding for thousands of years, and that you need to understand like thousands of years of history in order to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict. When in fact, in the case of both the Rwandan genocide, Rwandan history, the ethnic tensions in Rwanda, and the ethnic tensions in Palestine, um, you really need a solid understanding of less than like 100 years of history, and you'll be fucking solid. And in fact, trying to like trying to project this conflict further in time than that like 100 years or so, in both the case of Israel Palestine and the Rwandan genocide, trying to project that conflict, the roots of that conflict further back in time, is just going to confuse you. Like it's just not like a good project. It just doesn't make any sense. Um, and I'll talk about the reasons that that's true for Rwanda uh, now, and then I don't know, maybe I'll come back to the Israel Palestine thing later. But the conflict between Hutus and Tutsis, although it's sometimes talked about as an ancient tribal conflict, is not that ancient, and I would argue it's not even that tribal. Um, the two groups, Hutus and Tutsis, are not as old as people say they are, and this is sometimes kind of confusing because if you go to Rwanda and you say like, "What's a Hutu? What's a Tutsi? Tell me the history of these two groups," what you'll hear is some fucking bullshit that was made up relatively recently. Um, and this is actually kind of similar to what happens in the Balkans. Like ethnic identities like Serbian and Croatian are the product of relatively recent history. It's not like if you went back to like the 6th century, there would be like Proto Slavs running around thinking of themselves as Croatian or something. And there's a similar process going on here. Um, the pretentious history word for this is ethnogenesis, the emergence of an ethnicity in history. And ethnogenesis usually involves like a backstory that explains why this ethnicity didn't just emerge, but has actually always been here. And that can be really misleading because outsiders will hear the ethnogenesis like mythology, and they'll take it at face value as history rather than as an explanation of a newly emerging identity category. Um, and that's sort of what happens in Rwanda. Like the categories of Hutu and Tutsi, from as best as we can tell, before European colonization, were like mm, not exactly ethnic categories, not exactly tribal categories either. They were basically groups that were more or less fluid. Like you could become a Tutsi, you could become a Hutu. Um, and Tutsis had a sort of web of associations around them, Hutus as well. You can basically think of Tutsis as pastoral herdsmen who generally have quite a lot of power, whereas Hutus are agriculturalists who generally have less power. So there's a relatively small number of these, powerful uh, uh, herdsmen and a larger number of these less powerful agriculturalists. And once you understand these as like sort of being like class, it makes a lot of sense that pre-colonization these were categories you could slip into and out of. Like if you're a herdsman and you lose your herds, congratulations, you're not a herdsman anymore. Um, but yeah, once European colonization happened, essentially what happened is the colonizers came and they, understood these categories and they were like, ah, I know, I've heard this one before. That's a race. You're talking about a race. And so this period of history is when Hutu and Tutsi start to become ethnic categories. Um, More and more they take on the form of ethnic categories, and it's sort of weird to think about, but like Germany was the country that initially colonized Rwanda, so you have like these sort of like proto-Nazi like racial ideas entering into entering into Rwandan thinking. Anyway, by the time Rwanda is like well established as a colony, these categories have become not mutable at all. They're like ethnic categories, and the um, eventually the colonial government will start assigning people like identification cards that have Hutu or Tutsi written on it as like an ethnicity. And by that point, you have like ethnogenesis has occurred. Like this formerly class category has become an ethnicity. And because these categories, this backstory really helps to understand like the position of Hutus and Tutsis in Rwandan society, because uh, like it makes sense of the fact, for instance, that Tutsis are hated for being like in charge of everything, because essentially what happened is you took a word that meant guy who's in charge and you turned it into an ethnicity. And yeah, surprise, surprise, like the boss ethnicity, like they're in charge of a lot of stuff. Um, and it's not because of any sort of like genetic propinquity to like being in charge or any nonsense like that. It's because like until very recently, the category of Tutsi just meant like person who has lots of economic power. And now that that has become an ethnicity, like those people still have power. Um, but because that's combined with this sort of like ethnogenesis mythology, you end up with a situation where the idea that people have in their head is that Tutsis have just been in charge forever. Like they're just in charge of all sorts of stuff. Um, and so while decolonization is happening, decolonization is a pretty chaotic process in Rwanda. There is a civil war. The Belgians, the colony ends up going to Belgium after World War One. Germany has to give away all of their colonial possessions. They end up giving this one to Belgium. The Belgians basically like wash their hands of the situation. They just kind of fucking leave. Um, uh, to my knowledge, like no, there's no like major attempt to like create stability in Rwanda. If they leave and there's an immediate civil war, like all the better for them. It demonstrates, to their mind anyway, it demonstrates that they were doing something good because like as soon as we left, the country's in utter chaos. So the attitude of the Belgian government is not one that is conducive to stability in Rwanda. Pretty much as soon as they leave, there's a revolution that is aimed at deposing Tutsi rule. It is successful. Uh, a bunch of Tutsis are chased out of the country, and they end up going to Uganda. Uganda was a British colony, and this group of Tutsi refugees. Um, Eventually, they're going to end up in charge of Rwanda. But first, that community is going to spend an entire generation living in a British colony, and so when they come back, the like next generation of that community, they're all going to be speaking English, which is why Rwanda has English as a national language, even though it like wasn't a British colony. There you go. In case you were wondering, like I was a few weeks ago. Um. Anyway, so the Tutsis get chased out of town. They end up some Tutsis. This community of Tutsis gets chased into Uganda. They form sort of a what's that word? Not like an expat community, but like they don't like integrate into Ugandan society. Like they clearly are like a separate thing, and for a lot of them, their desire is eventually to return to Rwanda. Out of this immigrant community, a group called the Rwandan Patriotic Front is formed with the goal of making a conquest of the now Hutu-dominated Rwanda and replacing the leadership. Not exactly like the most noble goal, I would say. Um, but history is essentially going to make these guys into the heroes of the story because what happens in the interim is that the Rwandan genocide gets kicked off. The Rwandan genocide begins. The elements in control of the Rwandan government. I'm brushing past a lot of stuff. There's a lot of nuance here. There's like a presidential assassination that happens. So just keep in mind this is like a big oversimplification. But basically, the like Hutus in power uh, don't just want to like hold on to power. They don't just want to have like a democratic state where there's like some Hutus and some Tutsis. They want like Hutu power forever. And the organization, it's actually called Hutu Power, essentially becomes a genocidal organization. They're going to destroy all of the Tutsis in the country. And so, in that context, the Rwandan Patriotic Front goes from being like I don't know, like kind of a like warlord like organization. Not exactly the type of organization that people like. It goes from being basically like a group that wants to make a conquest of a country to being like the heroes of the story, right? Because they can take over Rwanda, they can put themselves in charge, and it's not just for their own betterment. It's not just for like them reacquiring power. It's so that they can end the genocide. To be clear, they had wanted to conquer Rwanda before, and they had even attempted to conquer Rwanda before. But once the genocide started, they tried again, and they were actually successful. And this time, it wasn't just like we're in power now; it was like we are stopping a genocide. So basically, it's the sort of weird story where circumstance turns this group from an organization that we wouldn't exactly admire to like the only people in the whole fucking world who like cared enough about the Rwandan genocide to actually do something. And as soon as they conquer the country, they become like a political organization, and they're still in charge of the country now. Um, there's a follow up conflict that is quite complicated, where essentially what happens is that Hutus who who there's two groups that leave. There's Hutus who fear justice, like they participated in the genocide and they don't want to face the consequences of their actions. And then there's Hutus who believe that the Rwandan Patriotic Front is itself a genocidal organization. And the RPF does commit atrocities, so those people are not, completely wrong. Um, and so those two groups, they leave Rwanda and end up in a neighboring country called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's a giant refugee camp there that is essentially like run by Hutu Power, this genocidal organization, which is it's complicated. It's a really complicated situation because you have this fucking refugee camp that is being run by genocidaires, which is like, I don't know, it's not good, but you also can't just, you can't like tell them to fuck off because it's a refugee camp and there's lots of people there who are like displaced people who are vulnerable. Um, okay, G, I'm trying to figure out like if I should go back and like detail some of that stuff. Um, that's the broad strokes of the Rwandan genocide, how it unfolded. And the reason that I want to just like explain the entire history there is that this stuff is not inherently that complicated. Like the story of the Rwandan genocide is much simpler than the story of World War One. Like the explanation for how it is that some guy getting shot in Bosnia results in a war between like Britain and Germany um, is much, much more complicated than the story of these two ethnic groups emerging and having, like, a sort of back and forth throughout history that ultimately culminates in this genocide. Like, the story is not that complicated, but because because people have sort of like written off African history as just like too complicated and too intractable, as soon as they encounter like even a little bit of complexity, I feel like they just sort of throw their hands up and are like, well, this is too complicated for me to understand. Like, I'm just not that interested in this stuff. And, like, I'm sure there are parts of African history that are nightmarishly complicated, but like, this just isn't that complicated. I'm sure there's like intricate details and stuff. I even as I'm like saying this stuff right now, I can already sort of like hear in my head someone writing an obnoxious comment about like, oh, this guy thinks everything's so simple. Um, but the point that I'm trying to make is that if you just compare like the stuff that people actually learn in history class with the stuff that gets dismissed as too complicated, it often doesn't actually have anything to do with complexity. It's more just that like people sort of feel like they have the license to write certain things off as complicated when they encounter any sort of difficulty or get a little bored or something. Um, okay, yeah. Anyway, I think I am not going to go into that much detail about the stuff that I just mentioned. Like, if you want more detail, you can read the book, or you can watch one of the like many YouTube videos that goes into more detail about the Rwandan genocide. Let me think. Is there more stuff that I want to add here? Um, no, no, I think I'm good. I guess I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that this book is absolutely fantastic. I wish there were more history books like this that sort of combined. Uh, the guy who wrote this is a journalist, so his instincts are really, really good on this stuff. Um, I wish there were more history books that combined like personal narrative and used it as a like jumping off point to explain the history because it's a very compelling read. I tore through this book in like 2 or 3 days, while also being like fairly comprehensive and comprehensible. Um, really like I don't know if every history book was like this. I just feel like I would know so much history. Yeah, it's probably a good thing that. The other thing that I've read a few reviews by like historians, and this guy does get a few things wrong. Like one thing people say is that he's overly sympathetic to the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which I can totally see. Um, when they're reconquering the country, like the part that's about the RPF reconquering Rwanda to end the genocide, he spends like one sentence talking about the atrocities that they've committed, which I feel like you know, it reminds me of a thing that I read in People's History of the United States, which was that the way that history books brush the stuff under the rug is that in a chapter that's 40 pages long, they'll spend one sentence on the Native American genocide because then you can't be accused of not mentioning it. And I feel like this guy is doing something similar for RPF atrocities. Like he mentions them in one sentence so that if someone claims like, oh wait, what about RPF atrocities, he can point to that one sentence. But, I read the book and I don't know anything about these RPF atrocities other than just like that they occurred. Um, so yeah, there are some valid critiques of this guy, but nonetheless, it's a fantastic history book. It's very informative and very very compelling. Okay, yeah, I'll stop my yapping. The book is "We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families," uh, and yeah, go out and read it right now. I demand that you read this book. It's incredible. Okay, bye bye.